When the 1972 NFL season got underway, no team was hungrier than the Miami Dolphins. The pain of their humiliating loss to the Dallas Cowboys in the previous year's Super Bowl still lingered, and the upstart Dolphins longed to atone for that defeat. They wanted redemption. What they got, however, was football immortality. That year, with their Super Bowl loss lighting a fire underneath them, Miami strung together the most remarkable, indelible season football has ever seen, one that cemented the 72 Dolphins as the greatest team in NFL history. Like most expansion teams, the Dolphins' beginnings were humble. After joining the American Football League in 1966, Miami endured some considerable growing pains, with the Dolphins putting together a combined record of 15-39-2 over their first 4 seasons. During those trying early years, however, behind the scenes, the nascent franchise was assembling an impressive stable of young talent. In 1967, the Dolphins used the 4th overall pick in the inaugural NFL-AFL Common Draft to select quarterback Bob Greasy, the Purdue standout fresh off a Sammy Baugh Award, which is given out annually to the nation's top college quarterback. In 1968, with the 8th overall pick, the Dolphins selected Larry Csonka, a bruising fullback and consensus 2-time All-American who had just set the Syracuse record for all-time rushing yards. And in the 1969 draft, Miami nabbed both Bill Stanfill, a Georgia product who had just been named the top interior lineman in college football, and Mercury Morris, a shifty running back who had set several records at West Texas State. Meanwhile, savvy trades landed them a pair of perennial Pro Bowlers in linebacker Nick Bonaconte and wide receiver Paul Warfield, giving them some experience and veteran leadership on both sides of the ball. By the time the AFL and NFL finalized their merger and consolidated into one league ahead of the 1970 campaign, the Dolphins were brimming with promise. They just needed someone who could turn that promise into results. Enter Don Shula. A venerated head coach who had led the Baltimore Colts to the Super Bowl in 1968, Shula was lured to Miami in 1970 by an overwhelming offer from Dolphins owner Joe Robbie, who named Shula both head coach and de facto general manager, and even gave him a 10% ownership stake in the franchise. In prying Shula away from Baltimore, Robbie was actually found guilty of tampering, which led NFL Commissioner Pete Rozelle to strip Miami of its first-round pick in 1971 and give it to the Colts. But it's a trade-off the Dolphins were more than happy to make. From day one, Shula transformed the culture of a Dolphins team that had yet to put together a winning season. As Morris explained years later, under their previous head coach, George Wilson, the Dolphins were allowed to head to the pool when the South Florida heat became too intense to practice. However, under Shula, the Dolphins were practicing 4 times a day, the temperature notwithstanding. Ultimately, Shula instilled an expectation of winning in Miami, and they did. In 1970, the Dolphins emerged as one of the most formidable teams in the NFL's expansive new landscape. Led by an explosive running game and a strong interior defense, the Dolphins finished with the second-best record in their conference at 10-4, marking their first ever winning season and playoff berth. And that was just the beginning. The following year, the Dolphins were even better, capturing their first AFC East Division title on the backs of the league's 4th best offense and 3rd best defense. That season, the Dolphins sent 7 players to the Pro Bowl, including Greasy, who was also voted as the league's MVP by his peers, as well as first-timers Csonka, Morris, and free safety Jake Scott. Meanwhile, the Dolphins also boasted the league's top scorer in kicker Garo Yepremian. However, as well-rounded as they were, Miami's rapid ascent to the NFL's mountaintop came up short. After sneaking past Kansas City in a double overtime divisional round classic before shutting out the Colts in the AFC Championship game, the Dolphins were outclassed by the Dallas Cowboys in Super Bowl VI. Squaring off against vaunted tactician Tom Landry and future Hall of Fame quarterback Roger Staubach, the Dolphins were out of sorts. They mustered only 185 total yards, turned the ball over 3 times, and managed only a field goal en route to a 24-3 Dallas victory, the first Super Bowl title in Cowboys history. It was a humbling defeat for the Dolphins, but it was also a galvanizing one. On the flight back to Miami the day after the Super Bowl, Shula implored each of his players not to forget the pain of that defeat. Shula, whose personal record in Super Bowls fell to 0-2 with the loss to Dallas, also stressed that next year, we're not only going to the Super Bowl, but we're gonna win it. Little did he know, however, that his Dolphins were about to put together the most magical, unforgettable season in football history. As the 1972 campaign loomed, the Dolphins were the same but different. The addition of Bobby Beathard as director of player personnel added significant juice to Miami's scouting and special teams operations. Meanwhile, Morris, who had voiced his frustration over receiving 0 carries in Super Bowl VI, was primed to take on a much larger role in the Dolphins' backfield, which for the previous couple seasons had been led by Jim Kick and Zonka, affectionately known as Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid. And, in a move that raised plenty of eyebrows, Shula had convinced his owner to lay out a whopping $90,000 for 38-year-old quarterback Earl Morrall, who immediately became the highest-paid backup in the league. With that, though, the Dolphins set out to avenge their loss in Super Bowl VI, and it quickly became clear that they weren't messing around. In their season opener in Kansas City, the Dolphins' defense bullied the favored Chiefs, forcing 4 turnovers en route to a 20-10 victory. A week later, Miami's vaunted backfield went off, with Morris, Zonka, and Kick accounting for 3 touchdowns and 228 yards in a commanding win over the Houston Oilers. In Week 3, the Dolphins' hot start was nearly halted by the Minnesota Vikings and their fearsome Purple People Eaters, but a controversial 4th down roughing the passer call late in the 4th quarter helped the Dolphins snatch victory from the jaws of defeat. Something was cooking in Miami. A month into the season, the Dolphins were the only undefeated team in the NFL. Their ground game was unstoppable, and their no-name defense, so called for its lack of star power, was impregnable. They couldn't have scripted a better start to their redemption season. And then disaster struck. In their Week 5 matchup against San Diego, the Dolphins' season was ostensibly derailed when Greasy suffered a broken tibia and dislocated his ankle on a first-quarter hit. Miami's star quarterback had to be taken off the field on a stretcher, and Zonka later described the gruesome hit as one of the most sickening moments he witnessed in his career. In that disheartening moment, the only consolation was that the Dolphins, thanks to Shula's insistence, had a capable, unusually accomplished backup quarterback in Morrall. He might have been pushing 40, but Morrall's resume was unassailable. He had been a Pro Bowler back in 1957, and he was improbably named League MVP in '68, when he started all 14 games for Baltimore in place of an injured Johnny Unitas and ended up carrying Shula's Colts to the Super Bowl. Now, almost a half-decade later, Morrall was getting another chance to fill in for an injured future Hall of Famer, and he was ready. Despite logging just 1 pass attempt through the first 4 weeks of the season, Morrall was as sharp as ever in relief of Greasy, throwing for a pair of touchdowns and completing 80% of his pass attempts to lead Miami to a 24-10 victory. It was a bittersweet win for the Dolphins, who quickly learned that they'd be without their starting quarterback for the remainder of the season, but as it turned out, they were in fine hands with Earl the Pearl under center. The following Sunday, the Dolphins squeaked past the Buffalo Bills, with Zonka, Kick, and Morris rushing for 223 yards and 3 touchdowns in a narrow 24-23 victory. A week later, Miami's defense stole the show, shutting out the Colts in a 23-0 romp in Baltimore. Halfway into their schedule, the Dolphins were 7-0. And while the prospect of putting together a perfect season with their starting QB sidelined was still unthinkable, the possibility became a little less fanciful with each passing week. In Week 8, the Dolphins ran roughshod over the Bills in Buffalo. In Week 9, they slaughtered the Patriots 52-0. And after securing a dramatic comeback victory over the Jets in Week 10 to improve to 10-0, the Dolphins faced virtually no adversity for the rest of the regular season. Miami won by double-digit points in each of their next 3 games, with their defense forcing a staggering 14 turnovers over that span, and their offense rushing for more than 700 yards. And when the 13-0 Dolphins tussled with the Colts in their regular season finale, they bookended their sensational campaign in fitting fashion, cruising to a 16-0 victory to finish the '72 season at a perfect and unprecedented 14-0. In the history of the NFL, only 2 other teams had ever recorded a perfect regular season, but neither the 34 Chicago Bears or 42 Bears did so over a 14-game schedule. Simply put, it was an astonishing feat. Doubly so with Morrall starting 9 games for Miami, but it also evinced how devoid of weaknesses the Dolphins were. In the end, Miami's offense led the league in points, total yards, and rushing touchdowns. Both Zonka and Morris notched 1,000 rushing yards, Warfield earned a Pro Bowl nomination, and Morrall was named first-team All-Pro along with Larry Little, the linchpin of an otherworldly offensive line. Meanwhile, the Dolphins' defense led the league in points against and yards allowed and finished second in turnovers. 4 members of their defense earned Pro Bowl nods, and Bonaconte finished second in Defensive Player of the Year voting. As dominant and unprecedented as their season was, though, it wasn't over yet. The Dolphins were still 3 wins away from true redemption. And as the playoffs dawned, Shula had a dilemma on his hands. Greasy was ready to return. In fact, he even took a few snaps in Miami's regular season finale. Yet, when the Dolphins took the field for their divisional round matchup against Cleveland, it was Morrill who was under center. And although he wasn't at his best that day, the Dolphins' defense picked up the slack, returning a block punt for a touchdown to open the scoring and tallying 5 interceptions off Browns QB Mike Phipps en route to a 20-14 victory. Then, with the AFC Championship on the line the following Sunday against the Pittsburgh Steelers, Shula again stuck with Morrill. However, with the game knotted up at 7 at halftime and Morrill struggling, Shula decided to make a switch. When the second half got underway, it was Greasy, not Morrill, who was running the offense. And Greasy immediately rewarded his coach's decision. On his first pass attempt, Greasy connected with Warfield for a 52-yard catch, a play that set up a go-ahead touchdown for the Dolphins, who would ultimately escape with a 21-17 victory. 12 months removed from their humiliation against Dallas, the Dolphins were back in the Super Bowl, 1 win away from a championship, and 1 win away from becoming the first ever perfect team in NFL history. Standing in their way, Washington, a defensive juggernaut that had set a franchise record for wins that season and had easily dispatched Green Bay and Dallas en route to their first ever Super Bowl appearance. And now, Shula had a decision to make. Roll with Morrill, the guy who got them there, or go with Greasy, the superior quarterback? It was, as Shula later described it, the hardest decision of his career. In the end, though, the Dolphins starter in Super Bowl VII was the same guy who started for them in Super Bowl VI, Greasy. This time around, however, it was a different story. On an unseasonably warm January day in Los Angeles, the Dolphins took control of the game early, with Greasy playing a starring role. In the first quarter, Greasy hit Howard Twilley for a 28-yard touchdown pass, and Miami never looked back. The Dolphins then extended their lead to 14-0 on a kick touchdown and carried that 2-touchdown edge into halftime. And as the second half unfolded, Washington had no answer for Miami's defense, which tallied 3 interceptions over the course of the game, 2 of them from Scott. In fact, the only points Washington mustered came on an unforgettable misplay from Dolphins kicker Garo Yepremian, whose eponymous gaffe remains one of the most iconic turnovers in NFL history.
A 42-yard attempt by Yepremian. Snaps it down. The kick is blocked. Rolling loose on the field. It is picked up by Garo. He tries to throw a pass. Deflected in the air. Grabbed by Bass. 40, 35, 30. He's going to score.
Still, that late scare notwithstanding, and despite putting up 0 points in the second half, the Dolphins ultimately outlasted Washington, securing a 14-7 victory and cementing their hallowed place in football history. They weren't just champions. They were perfect. 17-0. They had found redemption and then some. Never before had an NFL team done what they'd done, and as the triumphant Dolphins carried Shula off the field that night, they surely wouldn't have figured that 5 decades later, football would still be waiting for its second perfect season. But as valiantly as the 85 Bears and 98 Broncos and 07 Patriots tried, the 72 Dolphins still stand alone, with their flawless season becoming equal parts motivator and mythology over time. They are football's gold standard, and until another team makes it through the Super Bowl undefeated, the 72 Dolphins will remain the only truly perfect team in NFL history. Thanks for watching. If you like this video and want to see more content like this, hit that subscribe button.